everybody for coming along and joining us today for this roundtable to mark the 200th anniversary of Dostoevsky's birth. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julie Fedor. I'm a historian here at the University of Melbourne and one of the conveners of the Melbourne Eurasianist Seminar series. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, of the traditional owners and custodians of this land. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and also extend respect to any Indigenous people present today. And I'm very happy to welcome you all here today to this event, which we're very pleased to be co-hosting together with the Australian Dostoevsky Society's Hegel Reading Group. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to Associate Professor Slobodanka Vladiv-Glover, who is going to be running the session. But just a couple of reminders before we start. Firstly, to please mute yourselves so that we don't get any background noise during the presentations interfering with the speakers. And secondly, we are recording today's session with a view to possibly publishing it online via the website of the Australian Dostoevsky Society at some point. So if you don't wish to be recorded, please do turn off your video now. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end. You can either pop your question in the chat or you can use the raise hand function, which you should be able to find down the bottom of your screen somewhere there. Okay, so I'll hand over to Boba now.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for hosting us. It's great to have this, to share your Eurasianist platform, which has been established now for quite some time and has a lot of very prominent speakers. So we are very honored to be hosted by you and University of Melbourne. I would just like to say that we have 4 speakers today, not all of whom are specialists in Dostoevsky, but they have dedicated their research time over the past 8 months to exploring a new avenue in Dostoevsky research, the connection of Dostoevsky and Hegel. For us today, Hegel is the signifier for Europe, so that the connection with Hegel also implies Dostoevsky's connection with European thought and culture. Over the past 8 months, most of the panel have met every week on Zoom for a joint reading and discussion of Hegel and Dostoevsky. What we are presenting today could be called an Australian perspective on the question, which still remains open in Dostoevsky scholarship. That is, the question of Dostoevsky in Europe. With this contribution, the Australian Dostoevsky Society honors Dostoevsky as a Russian writer, but also as a contemporary who remains as relevant today as he was in his own time 150 years ago. I will speak first to show the Hegel trace in Dostoevsky's life and give a short analysis of character portrayal in The Idiot in the light of Hegel's philosophy of the individual or of the individual will in the process of world history. Nicholas Ulbricht will follow with an analysis of Mishkin as a failed world historical individual, and Thomas will follow with an excursus into the function of the comedic in the structure of the individual character within the model of the relation of the general to the particular. Finally, Edward will be our discussant and will summarize. Welcome, everybody. I can't see who is here today, but friends from near and far, I'm very happy that you could be with us today. So this is my presentation. It is, I think, around 25 minutes, so I beg your indulgence. Dostoevsky scholarship has for over 150 years drawn inspiration for the interpretation of Dostoevsky's literary works from his publicistic works. The pronouncements made in dialogue by Dostoevsky's fictional characters have been carefully matched to Dostoevsky's pronouncements in his journal articles, his diary of a writer, and correspondence. This has been the dominant context for the creation of a master narrative about Dostoevsky's alleged political conservatism, nationalism, and religious beliefs. It has fed into the myth of a cultural exclusivity of the Russians and of a presumed Russian soul. This has led to a characterization of Dostoevsky as a Russian writer who repudiated European civilization. Nothing could be further from the truth. According to our reading of his literary works, Dostoevsky was the greatest European writer Russia ever produced. In the topic of our panel, Dostoevsky in Europe, we take Hegel to be the signifier for Europe, as I said before. Our panel has re-examined Dostoevsky's life and has found a compelling new context for what motivated Dostoevsky's publicist output, a context which has been hidden in plain sight. This context began to take shape in 1849 as the sentence was read out at the Semyonovsky Square to Dostoevsky and the other 21 Petrushevsky co-accused. This is the sentence. After the careful consideration of the military court, the General Auditoriate has reached the conclusion that all of the accused are guilty as charged, whether to a greater or lesser degree, of intending to overthrow the fatherland's existing laws and national order, and are therefore condemned to death before a firing squad. The former engineer, Lieutenant Dostoevsky, it goes on, age 27, for participation in criminal plans for the circulation of a private letter containing rash statements against the Orthodox Church and the highest authorities, and for the attempt to distribute subversive works within the air with the air of a lithograph, condemned to death before a firing squad. Dostoevsky spent his entire post-exile life trying to live down this sentence, and yet at the same time to remain true to his authentic vision of the life, ideas, and culture of the heirs of Peter the Great's Europeanized Russian elite, of which he was a part. His efforts in this started when he had to lobby hard in 1857-9 to restore his right to publish, as well as to return to European Russia. He was also in humiliating financial circumstances throughout the 1860s with the prospect of going to debtor's prison. He and his new wife, Anna Grigorievna, often had to pawn furniture or his watch or his wife's coat to carry on with basic expenses in Russia and abroad. This ended only in 1877. He was under police surveillance throughout his life. This ended only in 1875. Under the political gaze of the Tsarist Russia, his start to his literary career, he paid for this political gaze with his literary career and his health. His first documented epileptic attack came in Siberia and was reported in his 1854 long letter to his brother from Omsk. In the course of his life, and since his death in 1881, many myths have been formed about what Dostoevsky thought and what he believed. What our team found in looking at Dostoevsky's life is that the ex cathedra statements the writer made in his journal articles and so on can best be summed up as the writer's laboratory, and therefore at best represent circumstantial evidence of his views and personal beliefs. We do not claim that the direct expression of his beliefs was inauthentic, only that in the context of his personal political encounter with the Tsarist apparatus of censorship and political repression, Dostoevsky developed a public persona in order to carry on with his revolutionary creative work. The need for such a public persona was compelling when we take into account how much was at stake for Dostoevsky if he were to declare his real views publicly, as in 1848-49. Even in his publicist works, his controversial views on Russia's historical development and place vis-à-vis Europe were clad in metaphors, which are hard to take at face value. He did this in order to create a kind of smokescreen, we could say, behind which he could publish his novels, which gestated in him throughout his exile. In 1860, he rebooted his literary career in St. Petersburg with his works Notes from the House of the Dead and The Insulted and the Injured, but set to work on his public persona in his journal Vremya, started under the official editorship of his brother Mikhail, because he couldn't be an editor at that point, even though he had all these clearances. The journal gave him the opportunity to follow events in Russian public life and to diagnose the trends in Russian civil society, which, by his own admission, formed the lifeblood of his creative writing. Our thesis is that the polemical style which he developed in his articles gave him the opportunity to test his hand at a new narrative genre, which we shall call dialectical, and which Bakhtin has identified as polyphonic. We also claim that his interest in everyday events seems to stem from his deep interest in Russian historical development, inspired by his encounter with Hegel's thought on spirit or Geist and spirit's relation to the world. Now, as to the evidence of contact with Hegel's thought, Dostoevsky's contact, there is forensic evidence. There is forensic evidence of Dostoevsky's deep interest in Hegel's thought. Suffice it to say that Dostoevsky read Hegel, quote unquote, every day in 1854 while in exile in Semipalatinsk, according to the testimony of Baron Alexander Wrangel, the 21-year-old public prosecutor who befriended Dostoevsky and who supplied Dostoevsky with books. According to a recent paper, 2004 paper by Laszlo Feldeni, entitled Dostoevsky Reads Hegel in Siberia and Bursts into Tears, this is what Wrangel said. Wrangel does not disclose in his memoir the name of the book that they were studying. He only mentions its author's name, Hegel. We do not know which book of Hegel's that Wrangel, who subscribed to the Augsburger Allgemeine Zeitung, ordered for Dostoevsky from Germany. So let us select one. The Lectures on the Philosophy of History, which Hegel delivered between the autumn of 1822 and the spring of 1831 at the University of Berlin. The lectures were first published in book form in 1837. Then in 1840, a new revised edition appeared. It is possible that Wrangel, after some browsing, may have ordered this book because in it, Hegel mentions Siberia. True, it is only a few words, and they explain why Hegel will not be discussing Siberia. He commences his discussion of Asia, quote unquote. We must first of all eliminate Siberia, the northern slope of Asia, for it lies outside the scope of our inquiry. The whole character of Siberia rules it out as a setting for historical culture and prevents it from attaining a distinct form in the world historical process. Feldeni is one of the first Dostoevsky scholars of recent history to raise the issue of Hegel in relation to Dostoevsky's views on identity and the cultural process Hegel called Weltgeschichtlicher Prozess. The only substantial earlier study dates back to the 1930s and to Dmitry Chizhevsky's Hegel in Ruslan, first in German, then translated into Russian, Hegel v России. The Heidelberg scholar started work on this book as a Menshevik emigre postgraduate in Prague in 1924, where he also belonged to the International Hegel Association and the Prague Linguistic Circle. The Prague Linguistic Circle, as we all know, was the cradle of Russian formalism and structuralism. In the 1930s, Chizhevsky presented a paper at the International Hegel Congress in The Hague on Hegel among the Slavs. All these are topics for further investigation, as you can imagine. Now, in Hegel in Russia, Chizhevsky demonstrates that the Hegel reception in the 19th century amongst the Russian intellectuals was, in my opinion, the way I read Chizhevsky, enormous and ongoing from the 1840s onwards. I'll skip a little bit of detail. However, despite citing all the known references to Hegel in Dostoevsky's correspondence and pointing out some overlap of concepts such as Volksgeist or Narodny Duch and the reality of concepts, Realität des Begriffs, Chizhevsky claims that to read Hegel's influence into these concepts is far-fetched. Dostoevsky was, according to Chizhevsky, more likely to have gleaned them from the Russian Schelling followers, such as Belinsky, and been influenced by Schiller and the German Romantics. This view is still dominant in Russian scholarship today. We beg to differ. Our reading of Hegel, in conjunction with Dostoevsky's publicist and aesthetic works, have inspired us with the thesis that Dostoevsky was acquainted with Hegel's philosophy, directly or indirectly, through the Russian intellectual reception of Hegel ever since the 1840s, which Chizhevsky also concedes. Dostoevsky took his knowledge of Hegel to a higher level during his Semipalatinsk years and continued his acquaintance through easy access to Hegel's works while he traveled or lived abroad intermittently from 1862 to 1871. The novel, The Idiot, was completed while he lived in Europe. The overlay of Hegel's thought, in particular Hegel's philosophy of history, is for us unmistakably present in The Idiot. I will now attempt a brief analysis of the method of characterization and temporality in The Idiot through Hegel's theory of history and subjectivity. Hegel's philosophy of history goes hand in hand with his theory of subjectivity. Both have, as the overarching context, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, Phänomenologie des Geistes. Spirit can be understood as an actualized totality that belongs to the domain of thoughts and emotions of an individual subject who realizes himself as self-consciousness. Freud would have described Geist as the domain of das Psychische, the psychical, or that which belongs to the psyche, just to bring Hegel up to speed with some more modern science, but we have to leave it at that. Thus, Hegel's philosophy of history and theory of subjectivity coalesce into one model in which the world historical process comes to expression through the world historical individual. For the spirit, quote, realizes itself or is, quote, revealed, and my explanation is revealed as in it becomes a phenomenon which comes into appearance, is revealed in the historical process through the will of the individual subject. Looked at from another angle, the crux of Hegel's deliberations in both the phenomenology of spirit and philosophy of history is the question of the relationship between the general or the universal and the particular. The general is the concept, Begriff, while the particular is the individual consciousness, which processes or actualizes the general through history, through the historical process. But not all history is the same. Peoples and civilizations go through historical stages, or history finds different peoples in different phases of the development of world history. Hegel maps various societies and civilizations according to the schema of 1, original history, 2, reflective history, 3, philosophical history. Nick will speak more about this. The individual will is the mover of history according to Hegel. Quote, without passion, nothing great in the world has been accomplished, unquote. Nothing happens without individual passion, Leidenschaft. But Hegel is not fully satisfied with this word Leidenschaft. It does not express what he means. It usually implies something bad, he says, something that should be fought and repressed. That is not what he means, he says. He means by passion, the concentration of the will upon a purpose, Zweck. Zweck, of course, is a Kantian term, which is that person's own, a particular content, which is at one, united with the will of that person, that it makes him what he is. Then follows the tautology as definition of the subject or the individual. For the individual is such a one that is there, not man in general, for such a one does not exist, but a particular man. This is my translation. I depart from Alvarado here because it doesn't stick to the German, which is, denn das Individuum ist ein solches, das da ist, nicht Mensch überhaupt, denn der existiert nichts, sondern ein bestimmter. World history comes into concrete expression through this individual that just is. In other words, the individual is the particular, the finite, while Geist or spirit is the general and infinite. World history looked at through the perspective of the particular is a conglomeration of individual wills, or as Hegel puts it, a vast congeries of volitions. In other words, a heterogeneity of particulars. Quote from Hegel. Thus, in the shape of natural existence, of natural will, that which has been called the subjective side, physical craving, instinct, passion, private interest, as also opinion and subjective conception, straightway is present for itself. This vast congeries of volition, interests, and activities constitutes the instruments and means of the world spirit for attaining its goal, Zweck, of elevating it to consciousness and making it reality, unquote. Reason is the highest instance in Hegel's hierarchy of concepts. In fact, reason is the frame of Hegel's philosophy of history. Hegel claims reason governs the world and has consequently governed its history, quote unquote. Hegel refuses to admit any higher instance than reason, any higher purpose than the coming into consciousness of natural instincts. Hegel's model of subjectivity has been called expressivist. I'm skipping a quote. We need to move on. Now, Hegel's model of subjectivity, which is expressivist, is mirrored in the idiot. It models the characters in the idiot in which there are no historical types, no social types, in which class is reduced to a floating signifier like money, those who have and have no money, and in which identity is difference and synchronicity, not chronotope as a spatial temporal setting. At one point, Hippolyte says to Mishkin, «Очень рад, что вы на человека хотите походить». This is in chapter 8, part 4, after the vase incident. Glad you want to resemble the image of the man. The subtext of this appears to allude to the famous phrase ecce homo, applied by Pontius Pilate to Christ as he presented him for the crucifixion. But here it does not refer to Mishkin's Christological profile in the literal sense. It delineates Mishkin instead as a Hegelian man, who is a successor to the Renaissance Vitruvian man, who just is, who is there. All the characters in the idiot are there, which explains the dramatic, scenic, and even theatrical structure of Dostoevsky's novel. Above all, the characters are self-conscious. They speak what they think, or they lie about what they think. But self-consciousness is everywhere in evidence. It comes to expression in a mode of excess. All represent one or other form of eccentricity, which comes to expression as willfulness, caprice, and childishness. In other words, extreme egocentrism becomes a kind of principle of characterization. This can be said of all the characters, irrespective of their role on the social and political spectrum of the world of the novel. Mishkin is part of that spectrum and is the ontological face of eccentricity with his imputed idiotism. In the introduction to his philosophy of history, Hegel distinguishes between the abstract and general principle of the purpose and concept, Begriff, of spirit, Geist, which is an abstract potentiality on the one hand, and its actualization and realization as will, defined as, quote, the activity of man in the widest sense. The principle, or Grundsatz, or maxim, or Gesetz, and the purpose, or Zweck, existing in principle, are thus actualized in the particular will or the particular human being who brings needs, instincts, passion, and inclination into play. This individual has his preferences and is, moreover, entitled to have them. Quote from Hegel. That some concept of mine should be developed into act and existence is my earnest desire. I wish to assert my personality in connection with it. If I am to exert myself for any object, it must in some way or other be my object. I must at the same time satisfy my purpose in it. This is the infinite right of personal existence, to find itself satisfied in its activity of labor, unquote. This is a new language of individual rights, of instincts, of private desire, and the quest for satisfaction, which is creating a new readership, as well as sketching the outlines of a new age with its new people. These new individuals who have entitlements, or who are at least entitled to self-assertion, are in principle mirrored in the new people portrayed in The Idiot in the Burdovsky group. But not only the new people, with their exaggerated and patently false demands for an inheritance to which they are not entitled, or are they, are represented as pushing their individual will and caprice. All the main characters are represented as capricious individual wills, Mishkin included, whose appellation, idiota, in the Greek meaning of the word, signified a private person and not one without reason or not in his right mind. All these individual wills are seen through their expressivity, heightened by the use of comedy and theater of the absurd, which uses elements of the puppet theater. The similarity of Dostoevsky's characters in The Idiot with marionettes was noted by his early readers. The significance of this form of characterization is that comedy, like music, constitutes the purest form of individuality, stripped of the concept, Begriff, and thus makes character into an embodied yet abstract expression of the particular. This total overlap of harmony of the general with the particular is the purest representation of Geist, spirit, or as I have claimed elsewhere, the Freudian unconscious, in its historical realization. Do you know how many minutes this has been?
About 25.
Yes, well, I'm afraid I have to stop here. I cannot go into temporality. I have to leave the floor to my colleagues. I will not read the end of this, but maybe it will come out in the discussion. Thank you very much. Now we have Nick.
Hi. So my contention, in line with the other speakers on this panel, is that Dostoevsky was familiar with Hegel and that this text, The Idiot, is written with the application of the dialectic first and foremost. In this way, Dostoevsky's realism in The Idiot is very different to what his contemporaries in England and France have done. In Dickens, we get a window into the world of early industrial Britain that can be enjoyed passively without any need to decode such history. Similarly, in Flaubert, we get a window into the revolutionary France. In The Idiot, however, we get no such window. Only we get the occasional glimpse here and there into what the prominent narratives and discourses were at this time. But Russia, as it were, does not exist in this text. The realism here is not in the specific details on the train ride to St. Petersburg, or the money being burnt in the fire by Nastasia Filipovna, or in the treasured vase being destroyed at the false engagement party. Rather, the realism exists within Dostoevsky's depth of insight into the forces of history that were operating on the economy, the culture, and the social relations within Russia upon his return from exile. In this scene, I will argue then that The Idiot is a dialectic discussion through which Dostoevsky refutes Hegel's claim that the Slavic people were not in world history, and that indeed the younger characters or generation are each seeking throughout the story to step into world history through their expressions of nihilism, atheism, and attempts at conscious self-awareness of their own desire. It is necessary, though, to ground this discussion in the work of Hegel, and specifically in his philosophy of history. We have understood today some of the evidence for Dostoevsky's encounters with Hegel's work, specifically his request to receive Hegel's history of philosophy unofficially from his brother in order to evade censorship whilst in exile. Any concrete evidence of this, unfortunately, is scarce and indeed concealed for obvious reasons. Millicent has highlighted, though, our main point of interest in this matter, and that is that Feldeni is one of the first Dostoevsky scholars of recent history to raise the issue of Hegel in relation to Dostoevsky's views on identity and the cultural process Hegel called the world historical process. To begin with then, Hegel's three stages or modes of history are as follows. The first is original history, in which descriptions are for the most part limited to deeds, events, and states of society which they had witnessed before their own eyes and whose spirit they shared. The next is reflexive history, which, quote, is history whose mode of description is not connected to the times, but which regards the spirit above and beyond the present, unquote. Finally, there is philosophical history, or the stage in which an individual, nation, or peoples enters into world history. Hegel goes to some length here to distinguish this third mode of history from the preceding two, which he suggests, quote, their nature was self-evident, unquote. Whilst he doesn't use the term critical, it is clear that Hegel is outlining here that through thought and engagement with the dialectic, a more thoughtful approach to history can be developed. He writes, quote, the general idea is that the philosophy of history means nothing but the thoughtful consideration of it. But thinking is something from which we cannot abstain. It is this that distinguishes us from the brutes. And there is a kind of thinking in knowledge and recognition, in instincts and volition, to the degree that they are truly human. In Dostoevsky's The Idiot, we see several examples of all three forms of history interacting with one another. In the first, we have absurd and outright bizarre narratives from General Ivolgin, who, for example, discusses his own experiences at the feet of Napoleon. However, for the most part, the characters are living in Hegel's reflective history, one that carries on unconsciously the traditions of the past, such as the narratives of Peter the Great's Reformation, and a veneer of exquisite manners that makes the phenomenological differences between each of the characters masked. It is Dostoevsky himself, though, who is stepping into world history by presenting this text as a whole as a form of philosophical history. The Idiot, as a comedy, is deeply contemplative work that, for a sharp reader, a new reader that Dostoevsky is seeking to create, offers a philosophical history of Russia at the emergence of this major social change. Our panel, in line with other contemporary scholarship on the issue, and through our study of this work, has determined or has considered that Hegel's entire world history ultimately rests on the relationship between the general and the particular. However, going further here, I contend that this relationship has been, as Dostoevsky suggests, mediated through religious dogma, preventing any movement out of reflective history and into philosophical history. And we see this when we were reading Hegel and had some perplexity around his treatment of Christianity. And we wondered if, like Dostoevsky, he was playing a sort of language game to evade censorship. Particularly, we were interested whether there was a mirroring of sorts between Hegel's discussion of God's purpose as a metaphor for freedom and Dostoevsky's representation of such through Mishkin's messianic speech. Hegel outlines then the role of Christianity in the formation of world history, writing, quote, "In the Christian religion, God has revealed himself. That is, he has given us to understand what he is, so that he is no longer concealed or secret in existence. The development of the thinking spirit, which has proceeded from this foundation of the revelation of the divine being, must ultimately advance to comprehending with thought that which was originally presented to the feeling and imagining spirit. The time must eventually come to understand that rich product of creative reason, which is world history," unquote. Certainly, for both Hegel and Dostoevsky, this imagination, or first form of history, has been dominated by forms of Christianity throughout Europe, and especially in both Germany and Russia. As such, any act of seeking to go beyond this, to be critical of Christianity's claims on history, was seen as heretical and obviously very dangerous. It is worth emphasizing then the great risk that both thinkers were taking in their authorship and the talent and the skill they have executed in getting their ideas out to a broader audience. Hegel drew on the conception of providence to challenge the conventional thinking of the time. World history here could be examined as a series of cascading moments of human agency. Providence, as such, can be seen as a sort of cover for a much deeper Enlightenment view of freedom. The emphasis that Hegel places on the role of theodicy of history is necessary and important in understanding the break he is making from conventional thought. This is reflected in The Idiot as an ensemble cast of characters arranged by Dostoevsky. Each seek to voice their desire for a history that is vanishing, has already vanished, or indeed perhaps never existed in the first place. To be more specific about my reading of this, there is a two-pronged approach that Hegel has used to establish such claims in his own work. He writes, quote, "The first remark we have to make, and which, though already presented more than once, cannot be too often repeated when the occasion seems to call for it, is that what we call principle, final goal, purpose, or the nature and concept of spirit is something merely general and abstract," unquote. Thus, we can conclude, one, that spirit is merely general and abstract, and two, that the activity of man is driven by will in the widest sense. As Hegel writes, quote, "A second element must be introduced in order to produce actuality, and this actuation, realization, and its principle is the will," as Millicent quoted before, the activity of man in the widest sense, unquote. Furthermore, and perhaps this is a part of that censorship evasion, Hegel is at pains here to differentiate the Germanic people as having already come into world history, a contrast he draws with the Slavic peoples. And this, we think, was a provocation that Dostoevsky took seriously in his own work. And we can see this throughout his entire bibliography. Millicent has gone to some lengths earlier to highlight how Dostoevsky's fear of rearrest, a fear that was realized towards the end of his life, was a driving motivating force for developing a public persona which was in contrast to his poetics. The question here remains then, what was the aim of this poetics? I argue that Dostoevsky, like Hegel, and like Millicent said, was seeking to create a new reader. This new reader would be a new thinker, one capable of engaging with philosophical history, in line with the Enlightenment values that Tom will argue lead to a form of secular humanism. Dostoevsky does this through a dialectical treatment of the phenomenologies of each character that are in constant conflict with one another throughout the idiot. But I will now narrow my focus to just the vase scene. In this scene, the ideas that Hegel was working with are explicitly continued by Dostoevsky to create a reader who was able to transcend the narratives of the old and the traditional and work towards a new approach towards history. The stumbling block, however, for Dostoevsky, which he fought valiantly against, appears to be the theology that had pervaded the feudal age and that was rapidly ending in Russia during the 1860s. This revolutionary act, though, is only visible if you read it, is not visible if you read it literally. Indeed, it is a secret code and only becomes visible to the new reader, which in turn is the new thinker, a dialectical thinker who is engaged in philosophical history and as such has emerged into world history. The first hints we get of this process come early in this false engagement party. Dostoevsky writes, quote, "The charm of elegant manners, simplicity, the apparent candor was almost magical. It could never have occurred to him that all this candor and nobility, wit, and lofty personal dignity was perhaps only a magnificent artistic veneer. In the spirit of their impressive exterior, the majority of the guests were, indeed, rather empty-headed people who in their smugness did not realize themselves that much of their excellence was just a veneer, for which they were not responsible, and for they had acquired it unconsciously and only by inheritance," unquote. This first passage establishes a complex nonverbal language of social cues that are taking place all around Mishkin, but to which he is oblivious. Yet Dostoevsky is quick to reveal that Mishkin is not alone in this misreading of their relationships onto others. The Olympian bureaucrat, the General Yapunshin perceives as his benefactor, is a parallel example to this. Quote, "The general, though," unquote, Dostoevsky writes of Yapunshin's superior, quote, "did not by any means consider himself to be General Yapunshin's benefactor," unquote. This back and forth between each character is what each character is hoping for or wishing to avoid in terms of the spectacle is, with the exception of the prince, another rehearsal of reflective history as I have defined above. But this contrast allows Mishkin to stand out as the only thoroughly modern subject, although he also is still in reflective history, who is conscious, but is conscious of his own phenomenology. Due to his theological dogmas, he is unable to step out of reflective history and step into world history. Throughout what Dostoevsky describes as the prince's delirious tirade and what others have discussed as his messianic speech, there is a glimpse of Russian discourse that was occurring at this time. Discussions around how to manage agricultural estates in the wake of the emerging conditions of capitalism in Russia and a strong prejudice against the Jesuits that is shared by all who are present. Prince Mishkin then attempts to share his own opinion, which is in line with the broader prejudice of the group, but is outside the manners and expectations of polite discussion. He says, quote, "No, sir, no. It is not only a question of theology. I assure you it isn't. It concerns us more closely than you think. That's our whole mistake, that we are still unable to see that it is not exclusively a theological question. Oh, we must organize our resistance and do it now. Now, it is necessary that our Christ should shine forth in opposition to the ideas of the West, our Christ, whom we have preserved and they have never known, not by slavishly swallowing the bait the Jesuits spread for us, but by carrying our Russian civilization to them. We must now stand before them, and don't let it be said among us that their preaching is elegant, as someone has just said now. Unquote. After a series of challenges and accusations that the prince is exaggerating, he continues and eventually lands on the following point. Quote, but that's what their anguish has brought them to show the thirsting and parched companions of Columbus the shores of the New World, show a Russian the Russian world, show him the renaissance of the whole of mankind in the future, and perhaps its resurrection by Russian thought alone, by the Russian God and Christ, and you will see into what a mighty, truthful, wise, and gentle giant he will grow before the eyes of the astonished world, astonished and frightened, for, judging us by themselves, they cannot even imagine us free of barbarism, unquote. There is a broader meta-narrative that can also be read here. Dostoevsky's own movement into world history. His project throughout his entire literary career, and in particular here through this awkward and unseemly spectacle, is to create a European man, one that rejects Russian nationalism, but is ultimately sensitive to the changes in the discourse, the fever and social unrest that was seeking out a new direction, a new society, and a new history. Who is the Russian Christ? Perhaps this was a placeholder for Lenin, but Lenin is outside the scope of our work. We can see this in our work, though, as his awareness of that perceived social desire for a savior of the Russian people that is also reflected in the fanaticism of characters like Pavlishev and, in the end, even Aglaya. There are no common or typical characters in this story. As such, the text becomes an explicit rejection of the manifestos of 1840s realism. It is a bending of the genre to suit this new reader, to suit a people who had yet to experience their own version of an industrial revolution. Thus, Dostoevsky has worked to create characters that are egocentric individual wills in the Hegelian sense, as Millicent said. Ultimately, the old guard are precluded from entering into world history. They reject Mishkin as an impossible fiancé for Aglaya, and consequently their own opportunity to engage in philosophical history. This scene provokes the reader through comedic device to engage in sublime moments, where after the laughter ends, there is only an uneasiness in the uncanny moments deliberately designed to cause accidental associations. The reader, therefore, is accidentally revealed to themselves in the flaws of each of the characters that they laugh at. In this sense, Mishkin's apologia of Christianity is seen as the apotheosis of reflective history. And to step into world history means, in this sense, to move beyond Christianity as an organizing principle. The old reader, who was raised on Romanticism, is thus precluded from seeing this directly. Indeed, the power of history and the changing social structures between the pre-modern subject and the modern subject that Dostoevsky is elucidating are summarized by Mishkin when he says the following. Quote, I came here today full of curiosity, fear, and confusion. I had to see for myself and form my own opinions as to whether the whole of this upper crust of Russian society is really worthless, has outlived its time, has exhausted itself by existing too long, and is only fit to die, but not without a petty and envious struggle with the men of the future, obstructing them and not noticing that it is dying itself. I never quite believed in it before, for we really never had an upper class in Russia, except perhaps by the courtiers, by uniform, or by accident, and now it has disappeared completely. Isn't it so? Isn't it? Unquote. Perhaps a similar question could be asked about today's society and the power brokers who apparently run the show. If I had more time, I might like to have answered that question by further exploring the parallels between Dostoevsky's observations of 1860s Russia and the recurrent themes which are still relevant today. Thank you.
Yeah.
So my paper expands upon the expressivity thesis outlined by Millicent. Despite its realistic coverage of profound issues of Russian life and culture, The Idiot is a comic novel. The comedic in The Idiot is a mode of representation which is related to slapstick or may even preempt the theatre of the absurd. No character escapes representation in this comedic mode, not even Prince Mushkin. His very first on-stage appearance, so to speak, with his thin coat and Stibleki shoes, looking incongruous in the winter setting of St. Petersburg society, is essentially comic. For incongruity is, according to Freud, the chief mechanism of comedy. It is a kind of negativity without being a contradiction. The comedic is the embodiment of identity as difference, which is Hegel's definition of the human subject. Thus, the comedic aspect of The Idiot connects with and supports the expressivist poetics about which Millicent spoke, and expressivity is the ideal perfect unity of thought and feeling. Bakhtin spoke of these in relation to Dostoevsky as the idei chuvstva, the idea thoughts. Nowhere is this unity more in evidence than in the comedic. While interest in the comic aspect of Dostoevsky's work is not new, it has not received extensive coverage in the scholarship. The classic work on humor in Dostoevsky is Ivan Lapshin's 1933 article, and there have been studies since, including Bush's 1986 monograph, as well as last week's Funny Dostoevsky conference at Dartmouth. Lapshin writes that Dostoevsky's early life was not conducive to humorous expression, though he also finds that following Dostoevsky's marriage to Anna Grigorievna, he found some sort of humorous catalyst which introduced the tragicomic mode into the writer's works. Lapshin concludes his study with comments to the effect that the use of the comedic in Dostoevsky has a philosophical function, contending that Dostoevsky chooses to expose the absolute evils of the world through the use of comedy as a means of exploring the justification of right action, often by the tool of the dialectical consciousness of his texts, like The Underground Man and Mishkin. Lapshin writes that, and here this is my own translated paraphrase, the underground figure comedically argues with others, argues with himself, lampoons, and through cathartic laughter, returns to the universal harmony of God. Lapshin's thesis, according to which Dostoevsky seeks to avoid religious affiliation, as well as find a way back to the harmony of God through humor, appears at first sight paradoxical, but it is not if we substitute Hegel's term spirit, Geist, for God. For Dostoevsky's God, who emerges in the Lapshin thesis, is akin to the much more secular Hegelian God, that is spirit itself. The concept of universal harmony may be slightly problematic, but it is clear from Lapshin's thesis on humor supports the notion that Dostoevsky was concerned with a secular humanism, using the vocabulary of the church as his medium, that is, a vocabulary external to the individual. If, however, we look at humor as a mode in which the unity of thought and feeling comes to individual subjective expression, we realize that it belongs to the particular, not the general. In Hegel's dialectic relation of the general to the particular, it is the concept, Begriff, which imparts the unity to the dyad. Emotions, including mirth and humor, are pure concepts. They are, as Millicent pointed out, in some instances akin to music. Lapshin was familiar with classical comedy and may have had in mind the classical definition according to Aristotle, which has been preserved in the fragment noted as the Tractatus Quaslinianus, henceforth the Tractatus. The Tractatus offers at least a foundational insight into the artifice of comedy from the ancient Greek perspective. And Aristotle highlights two especially important components of comedy, being diction and spectacle. These two components of comedy address the particular in Hegel's dialectic of spirit. Aristotle states that laughter, the first of the comic components, arises from diction, incident, and object. These all belong to the domain of the particular. Diction has several components related to wordplay, including homonym, metaphor, and speech style, and incident refers to the way in which the comic episode is constructed, with humor arising from incongruity, such as from the contrary to expectation, unintentional deception from the propensity toward wickedness, among others. In describing the object of comedy, Aristotle states that the role is entirely different from that of satire. Comedy is not an abuse or a reprimand, but rather the delicate revelation of errors of the soul. All of these elements of the comedy are present in the structure of narrative, the idiot. In fact, it has been argued by Millicent that the idiot consists of a myriad embedded narratives. And if we combine Millicent's thesis with our own assertion about the presence of elements of comedy, then we arrive at a narrative structure which is replete with comic device piled upon comic device in an agglutination of random particularities. As Millicent remarked, these peculiarities and particularities follow a Hegelian definition, as well as marking characters for synchronicity and highlighting the theatrical excess of the novelistic drama. These peculiarities and particularities embody the world historical process. Let us take, for example, one aspect of the characterization of several characters in The Idiot, but thinking particularly about Prince Myshkin. His full name and title, Knyaz Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin. Lev, from lion, while Myshkin is an altered diminutive form of the Russian mish, mouse. From the first moment of introduction to the prince, the reader expects humor. Not only is his situation so unexpectedly un-prince-like, traveling as a pauper with nothing but a small parcel of belongings, but his name is also a contradiction. He is the Prince Lion Little Mouse. And similar moments of name-based humor are very common in ancient comedy, which draws on the excess itself. The name of the Roman comic Plautus, for example, in full is Titus Macius Plautus, which translated comes to something like Dick Clown Flatfoot. The idea there is to inspire comedy, inspire even a smirk at the mention of the playwright's name. And this is all before the rollicking particularities of ancient comedy unfold on the stage. Dostoevsky appears to appropriate this classic device. In his comic hero's name, for example, readers already have a laughable contrast, a prince, a lion, and a little mouse in one figure. The second comic element drawn from the Tractatus is spectacle. Aristotle introduces spectacle via a description of comic catharsis, that enervated, emotionally purged feeling that occurs in response to a comic moment. These are enhanced by the predictable use of stock characters, but we don't see this in The Idiot. Instead of stock characters, we have unpredictable, non-conformist sorts of characters who cycle between various character roles dependent on the narratological needs of the scene. The comic is achieved by the emptying of the stereotypical, therefore, by the unexpected or the impossible. A particularly important instance of spectacle, which may be connected to Lapshin's cathartic moment and the restoration of harmony, is the first meeting of Prince Myshkin with the Epanchin women. Dostoevsky goes to great lengths to explain the finery of the Epanchin manor and recounts that the women have various feminine talents, like the three graces and charities, unusual beauty and names that recall character virtues, nobility for Adelaida, grace for Aglaia, and protection for Alexandra. Their behavior, however, is incongruous. This aspect of characterization is one of those Aristotelian elements, making fine characters seem like something else. The gentlewomen, who have all these fine talents, lunch 3 times a day. They are made out to be gluttonous, eating like horses against the backdrop of their opulent manner. In the same scene, the reader witnesses a somewhat raucous moment of humor, and this is the dialogue between the Epanchin women and Myshkin. It reads, Alexandra as an aside to Aglaia, the prince is probably a great rogue and not an idiot at all. Some lines later, Myshkin says, the thing that roused me was the braying of an ass. I was extremely struck with the ass and for some reason quite pleased with it. Lizaveta comments, a donkey? That's strange, but still, looking at her laughing daughters, not strange. I shouldn't be surprised if one of us fell in love with an ass. It has happened in mythology after all. Myshkin continues, ever since I have been awfully fond of asses, I began even inquiring after them. Lizaveta says, this is very strange. Why do you go on laughing, Aglaia? And you too, Adelaida. The prince told a story excellently. He saw it himself. Adelaida comments, I have seen an ass, mother. And Aglaia says, and I have heard one. end quote. The joke here is an example of the Aristotelian comedic homonym and metaphor. Alexandra thinks the prince is not an idiot, but rather is intent on fooling everyone. His story descends into the absurd, and there is an additional joke of the Russian for donkey, usul, perhaps referring not only to the donkey itself, but more colloquially to the idiotic person. In line with Alexandra's comment, it's perhaps the prince that the girls are referring to, or perhaps the commonplace nature of the excellent story. Not only is this a spectacle, but it's a matter of the improbable as well. Following the cathartic moment, which ends with the Yupanchian women laughing and Mishkin himself, the prince continues with a more philosophical explanation of his time in Switzerland, which culminates thus. Mishkin says, "I stood halfway up the mountains, surrounded by old resinous pines. The sky was blue, the sun shone, and everything seemed so still. If I went straight on, kept on going for a long time, I would reach the point of the horizon. There, I would find meaning to all things puzzling and start life anew. A life 1,000 times more splendid and more tumultuous than our own," end quote. This is a purely Hegelian moment. Mishkin responds to some sort of inner calling, and he's taken away from the city, but still within sight of it. He experiences the uncanny, the Kantian sublime, which is not nature itself, but the human capacity to imagine something greater. Mishkin transcends the mundane reality of the particular, that is his life in the city, and enters the Hegelian world of spirit. If we relate this to the philosophy of history, then this would be the moment when consciousness is still unrealized in the historical process. It would only be realized when Mishkin himself arrives in Russia and enters into the concatenation of relationships with other characters. The dialectic of opposites is manifest in the prince's words. He will find life a new, an exciting prospect, but also a tumultuous one. This is the dialectical nature of the prince's proposition, the vacillation between two extremes without judgment. How was he able to arrive at this? The answer is comedic catharsis, that allows for the character as well as the reader to become disarmed enough to experience the uncanny and able to there recognize the universal in the individual. The return to universal harmony, as Lapshin wrote, and as we have tried to argue here, from a Hegelian perspective, is the return to spirit. It is found through comic catharsis. The moment the laughter stops, the moment of the uncanny, allowing the individual to see the aspect of the universal in their own particular nature. Dostoevsky uses comedy as an overarching structure in his novel and as a means of advancing a poetics of morality that is based on secular humanism with Hegelian overlays.
Thank you. I'll just jump straight in. Okay. The heterogeneity of history is for the panelists found in the dialectic nature of what Bakhtin calls the polyphonic of the idiot. Between the dialogues and speech acts of the characters, the comedic and absurd form these take, and at the metatextual level. More precisely even, these levels of difference and conflict reflect Hegel's tripartite conceptual division of history. The first level is original history, in which we find general Volgan stories and in the narrative of Napoleon. The next is reflective history, which exists beyond the mere present. It is the world of Prince Mishkin, a modern figure that is yet still within the confounds of the symbolics of original history. Finally, there is philosophical history, or what is world history. This is the text itself, the idiot in this case, but of course Dostoevsky's text as a whole, which reach across history in the hopes of defining anew our readership even today. In Nick's presentation, there's a great sense of an antagonism inherent to the idea of what realism is. It's not as mimesis or portraying a true history as such, but of coding the level of Hegelian history within the text. The self-consciousness, to borrow a phrase familiar in Hegel and Bakhtin, of each character is at odds with history, or the absence of history as such. And in the text, this creates points of views that are not self-identical, that are in constant conflict. See, for example, in the description of the engagement party in The Idiot, where the veneer of civilization that is acquired stands against the other character's empty-headedness. Within these moments, Dostoevsky creates critical moments, either of transformation or of microcosms, vignettes under the magnifying glass that pinpoint the dialectical creation at work. And it is these ruptures that affects the reader as well. Indeed, helps to create the new reader that the panel has argued is so central here. These moments act metapoetically as well, alluding to the unfinalizable relation between literature and philosophy. In a word, the panelists are also transcribing this excess inherent in Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot for a new historical moment. This is, of course, also found in the remnants, the surplus, inherent in Hegel's philosophy of history, which unfolds not in a linear fashion, but through each particular and its manifestation in the universal. Tom has linked the poetics of comedy as the form that the dialectic operation between censorship and philosophy, and on the textual level, between each characterization takes place. One is here reminded of Bakhtin's concept of the carnivalesque or the Menopian satire, particularly evident in Dostoevsky's shorter fiction. Similarly with the notion of substituting God with Hegel's Geist. We see that the nature of Dostoevsky's work begins to open up to a radical new interpretation against a purely Christian ontology, which is not to say this is a mask inherent only to his public persona, but rather to the highly ambiguous meaning of the text itself. What the panelists have indicated convincingly is that in a number of different mediums, there is always a slippage, a double play at work, the double being a hugely familiar theme in Dostoevsky's work, which Tom illustrates in a very humorous and very direct way with the example of the lion-mouse dichotomy of Mishkin's name. And it's precisely through these comedic contradictions, these dialectic oppositions, that again, the text is brought, either laughing or through sheer terror, into the layers of history Hegel sets forth. Millicent's case for Dostoevsky's knowledge of Hegel historically can also be seen on the textual level in The Idiot, in the snare of the subject represented in the historical feuilleton, in the signifiers of history and the merging will of the subject. And moreover, not only will, but of passion, desire, and any other eccentricity. Again, as all panelists have suggested, the different medium this dialectic assumes in the text is presented in the very hyperbolic and stageness of each speech act. Dostoevsky creates a series of narratives and inner narratives representing the phases of the emerging and slipping world historical individual. I think crucial here is the heterogeneity with which this takes form in the characters in The Idiot, and which, in what Millicent has defined through the nature of expressivity, where all the characters are portrayed in excess, including both in, quote, caprice and childishness. This is reminiscent of Hegel's criticism of the argument for caprice as an argument for determining that one is free. The most ironic staging of this determining is precisely not a will aligned with reason, but any exterior cause that constructs the character as determined, which is here at the reflective level of history. A subject caught within its own present, much like Mishkin. The at times absurd dialogue in the levels of history stand in for the empty gesture, which for Hegel is a retroactive act of the content determining such an act as caprice. Hegel states, quote, "In caprice, it is involved that the content is not formed by the nature of my will, but by contingency. I am dependent upon this content. Ordinary man believes that he is free when he is allowed to act capriciously, but precisely in caprice, it is inherent that he is not free," unquote. Other Dostoevsky critics, such as René Perelmutter and Vinogradov, have also argued elsewhere that the characters in Dostoevsky's fiction become marionettes, who move according to the author's will, that is expressed in a hurly-burly of motion and activity. Lastly, I think what has been raised in different ways by each speaker is the question of what will is in operation in this new person of world history that Dostoevsky's The Idiot reflects. Is it through what Nick has suggested in the question of who is the Russian Christ, a placeholder that foreshadowed Lenin? Is it that of what Tom defines with the function of the comedic as a new secular humanism? Is it what Milton has called the emerging individual, the individual expressivity that is a harbinger for the modern Freudian unconscious in its historical realization? Is this something also perhaps which is the underside of the new person of history? Something that antagonizes, something that repeats across the levels of history, never to be sublated. A will that is perhaps also a will to destruction. Rebecca Comey argues in what is one of Hegel's greatest insight is the emptiness of the category of change. While there is transformative power in its opposite, in the resistance to change. That is, what can be called repetition as a signpost of something hidden and which keeps returning. This is also something that Sarah Young, in her analysis of The Idiot through the speech of Lebedev's apocalyptic view of history, alludes to when she states, quote, "The ideas are through this process dialogized, exposed to questions and doubts, and tested to see whether they can survive such debasement. In The Idiot, the ideas do not stand up well to this test, because by this stage, there is no longer a positive image at the center of the novel to sustain them." As the panelists have suggested, it is not only a question of the ambiguity inherent to Dostoevsky's public persona and the meaning of the text, but what message is being sent by the dialogue of the characters and the narrative itself. For it is not only a case of a binary between what is censored or uncensored, but rather what fails, or is surplus to, or is lacking in the relation between the subject and history that is revealed in the text. And why this failure, what Sarah Young calls this lack of a positive image at the center of the idiot, should rather be viewed as a complete lack of a center at all. Thank you.
So there are no questions yet in the chat, but if anyone would like to ask us questions, you can either use the microphone feature or you can, I'll monitor the chat to see questions there. But thank you, Julie, for hosting us, and thank you to my fellow panelists for their excellent presentations today. I think just to fill a bit of time if people are waiting to ask questions, that something I didn't get a chance to include but would have really liked to have included was that there's a suspicion we have that Hegel wasn't presenting this history of original reflective world history as being an ironclad one-way, like a train on a train line, but rather that, you know, and evident and perhaps in Rebecca Comey's work as well, there's this sense that you can slip back so that you could be in world history, but slip back into reflective history, or in some cases, original history. And I'm happy to expand on how that relates with contemporary ideas, if anyone is interested.
Can I just comment on the connection between our thesis about censorship and a public persona and the text? Our contention was that in the literary texts, Dostoevsky is completely open because he's protected by the complexity of what he's writing. The censor does not find a way into his text. You know, the censor is not the modern reader he's creating, right? And he bamboozles in his, for example, when he's writing the Brothers Karamazov, he writes to Pobedonoscev, this guy who is the head of the synod and sort of connected to the surveillance mechanisms under which Dostoevsky is constrained. He writes to him a big explanation of how in the next book, after he has talked about the negative Ivan Karamazov worldview and all that, he's going to produce a Russian monk and so on. But it's nothing like it's not at all similar to what he actually produces, because the Russian monk is a total metaphor. So in order to appease this Orthodox, this apparatchik of the Orthodox Church and of the Tsarist regime, he has to sort of say something ex cathedra, which will appease the powers that be. But in his book, it has nothing to do with what he has actually said to Pobedonoscev. If you read the book, you cannot possibly interpret the book through those remarks. So that was our idea, that whatever he said ex cathedra does not constitute a model for analyzing his fiction, because his fiction is far too complex. And when he reads Hegel and when he assimilates Hegel and transposes Hegel into his fiction, Hegelian concepts into his fiction, he's actually taking the Russian literary and aesthetic discourse into a higher sphere. It surpasses anyone else in Russia. It certainly surpasses Tolstoy, because in the Chizhevsky book on Hegel in Russia, Chizhevsky reports how Strachov heard from Tolstoy that Tolstoy could not understand Hegel, and he thought he dismissed Hegel completely. But he just could not understand Hegel. You know? He couldn't understand the dialectic, and I can imagine that it's very hard to read the dialectic. You know, so
that's a good segue, Millie, because Adrian has put a question into the chat, and we're getting a few questions coming through, which is really good. Keep any questions you have coming. So Adrian asks, is there any evidence at the time that his contemporaries were aware of Dostoevsky's obsession with Hegel, when so many of them were of the opinion Hegel was passé? We've implied that they were not, but that he was worried about rearrest and censorship.
I don't think his contemporaries were aware of Hegel in him. I don't think they read him correctly. They did not really. Dostoevsky's works have not really been decoded in any Hegelian sense until today's panel. There are no papers on Dostoevsky and Hegel which read Dostoevsky through Hegel. There's an absolute absence of scholarship on Dostoevsky and Hegel.
Yeah, I mean, and the standard Russian intellectual histories that I've read talk about, you know, Hegelianism as the key theme of, you know, of the generation of Herzen and Bakunin, and then even Herzen turns his back on it and start, you know, so that the 1848, if we read it through Herzen's account, he realizes that all of this world spirit gumph, as he says it, is not the key to liberating Russia, and that's that Herzen's direction then influences the populists, the Narodniki. But what you're suggesting is that, you know, that Dostoevsky is kind of the last Hegelian, well after Bakunin, and that which is, I mean, I think you've given very suggestive evidence for that. I would have thought that contemporaries could have seen that in him.
Well, they didn't really read Hegel
Yes.
properly either. You know, his contemporaries did not, for example, Danilevsky, Россия и Европа, Russia and Europe.
Yes.
Danilevsky's is a tacit response to Hegel's view of history, but he only mentions Hegel twice. And then he just doesn't bother. He doesn't bother to reference Hegel because he goes off on his own tangent. Dostoevsky does that up to a point too. You know, when he talks about Russia and the Russian messianic mission and all that, it's very Hegelian, but he doesn't decode it. He doesn't decode it. And as for Herzen's Hegelianism, it sort of changes. You know, they don't have one. They all interpret Hegel in their own idiosyncratic way. And when you talk of Russian Hegelianism, Belinsky, for example, he changes his mind. You know, he accepts Hegel one way, the way we would read him, and then when he's 10 years later, he's on this bandwagon of narodnichestvo, you know, populism and everything has to be narodnost. Then he goes away from the real Hegel, becomes more like the Marxist Hegel or the Koyevan Hegel, right? Or rather like Marx's reception of Hegel. It's fluid. It's not one. There's no one reception of Hegel in Russia. There's a lot of receptions of Hegel. I think some of it is being studied now, but we have to get on top of that. We haven't got on top of that. In the last 18 months, we had a big to do with getting on top of this Hegelian view of history. And then we'll see how that is transposed in the Russian discourses.
And that was, of course, in the last 18 months, you know, given actual history, it's there's been a lot to get on top of, so to speak. But, you know, it's allowed us to get together over this platform. So there are no more questions coming in. So I assume we were thoroughly convincing if there's no more questions, which is a great endorsement of our arguments.
I had another observation about, I mean, at the same time that he's kind of writing this, The Idiot, 1867 to 1869, you know, Tolstoy is completing the installments of War and Peace. They're both obsessed by war, by kind of world historical kind of issues and relationship with the individual. But of course, they reach diametrically different approaches. You know, the famous the epilogues in War and Peace are sustained explorations of cause and human agency in history, which most literary scholars don't want to read. You know,
well, it's interesting you mentioned War and Peace. Because when I looked at the view of history in War and Peace, Tolstoy's view of history, I realize now in retrospect that he does highlight, he does privilege the individual. The individual moves history. Both Kutuzov and that soldier, the peasant whom Pierre befriends, they are the real movers of history, not the big men, not Napoleon, right? So it's in a way sort of touches on Hegel's view of history, but I'm not sure at all that I wouldn't claim that Tolstoy got his cues from Hegel. He got them from somewhere else.
No, I think that's right. I think he's rejecting that earlier generation with their big systems, and he hates historians, for example, Tolstoy. He thinks they're full of baloney with their causes and theses and footnotes and bullshit. That's basically what he thinks. And that, you know, if we're really to look, we have to look at the contingencies and so he'll go into that. But it is interesting that the two of them writing at the same time, sort of very differently.
Well, if you want a literary historian's opinion on the comparative virtues of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Tolstoy is an 18th century writer, basically, even with Anna Karenina. He writes in an 18th century mode. Dostoevsky is a 20th and 21st century writer. You know, he overshoots the horizon of expectation of his contemporaries by light years. And of course, he overshoots Tolstoy. And the reason they never met, it was a bit of a conspiracy on the part of Strahov. There was a little bit of vanity involved. You know, Strahov was playing up to Tolstoy because Tolstoy was much more successful. socially and financially than Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was a bit of an outsider always. So while Strahov was a friend to Dostoevsky during his lifetime, as we all know, Strahov didn't do him any favors when he died. In the first biography of Dostoevsky, you know, he made claims about Dostoevsky on the strength of some confidences and conversations with Dostoevsky, which, you know, he made some dreadful inferences and insinuations about Dostoevsky's private life and private proclivities and so on, which is very difficult to negate because, you know, he was a contemporary. But on the other hand, they're very difficult to stomach. Nevertheless, we go from the creative end. Our starting point is Dostoevsky's literary work and Dostoevsky's aesthetics. Now, that is open to hermeneutic interpretation. Dostoevsky's life is not open to hermeneutic interpretation, or up to a point it is. We've sort of tried it. We've tried to say that he developed a public persona. So that was a sort of hermeneutic interpretation of the biography of Dostoevsky. However, that is speculative. What is on firmer ground is the hermeneutic methodology of trying to interpret a text and read a text through another text. And here we wouldn't even need the forensic evidence of Dostoevsky's familiarity with Hegel. We could just read it through Hegel, right? But in addition to having this right to just read it through Hegel or through any other text, if it is epistemologically appropriate, we also have some forensic evidence that, not just some evidence, but really hard evidence that Dostoevsky thought his entire life depended on his reading Hegel.
So, but why didn't he discuss that and in conversation when people asked him about his work?
He was afraid. He was simply afraid to give up. It was very secretive. If you read his biographers, read Geir Kietza, the Norwegian biographer, in 1981, published in English, first in Norwegian, then in English. Geir Kietza shows, when you read Geir Kietza, you get the impression that Dostoevsky had a miserable life. You know, it was really a very hard life. I mean, he was in chains for 4 years. He had scars on his wrists and on his ankles throughout his life. You know, it wasn't a nice experience. It was a dreadful experience. It drove him into himself. You know, after having tried to discuss publicly his ideas about socialism, Fourierism, not even socialism, but Fourierism, and the ideas which were discussed more or less freely in Europe, not entirely freely, because Fichte was dismissed from Jena because he was accused of preaching atheism, and then Hegel came to Jena in the wake of Fichte, right? So it wasn't entirely censorship-free in the German sphere either, but in the Russian sphere, it was absolutely, after 1849, he did not dare say anything that he really thought publicly to anyone, you know, friend or foe. That is my impression of reading his biography. So I think he was mortally afraid.
And there wasn't a clear distinction between who was friend and who was foe with who he operated with as well.
Yeah.
And that came through in some of the, not necessarily in what we discussed today, but within Dostoevsky's nonfiction writing, I guess you might say, in the journal he edited with his brother, we found, you know, borderline propaganda and to some extent even anti-Semitic narratives that would be, you know, potentially, I mean, we weren't able to confirm it, but there was a suspicion we had in discussion that this was around the time Dostoevsky was trying to create this persona, around the time that one of the chapters of what would end up being the Protocols of the Elder of Zion was also being distributed around Russia. So, and that's what, you know, I mean, you haven't asked the question, but I see a lot of parallels with how Dostoevsky was operating in relation to the power structure of that period, with the way that you know, certain things were reflected in very recent US politics, with a kind of almost dogmatic adherence to narratives that are patently absurd, and we see that actually continuing into, you know, today with you know, certain political fights. So that's interesting in light of Hegel. If you see like this movement, like a Napoleonic type figure can inspire a movement backwards from a reflective history into an original history, where it all becomes about grand stories of good and evil, and they're black and white, and there's a lack of nuance. You know, General Evolgin talks about Napoleon seeing in his eyes the spirit of Russia, and so every decision that Napoleon needed to make was by looking into this child's eyes and determining what was good or bad for Russia. But of course, as you pointed out, even in Tolstoy, that's not how things actually work. And so, you know, once you know that, you can read it as a form of irony, or even perhaps, if you're willing, a form of sarcasm on Dostoevsky's behalf. And there's all these different layers of coding that are going on there.
Can I just welcome my colleague Irene Zohreb from New Zealand, from Wellington. She has just joined us. I think she may have got the time difference a little bit wrong, because we have just finished our presentations, and now we are finishing our discussion. Hello, Irene. You are muted, so we can't hear what you're saying. If you're saying anything, can you hear it, Irene? Yes, maybe she can't hear.
I'm going to stop